scene. You can either move it on just the z-axis by pressing and holding on the blue arrow, just the y-axis by using the green arrow, or just the x-axis by using the red arrow, or you can move it along only two axes, so you can constrain it just to the y and x-axis. If you don't want to move it up and down, then you can keep it away from the z, or you can constrain it to z and x or z and y. Now, the next tool on the list of manipulator tools here is the rotate tool. Rotate tool, much like the move tool, has a gizmo here that you can use in various different capacities. So what it does is it will basically rotate the object around its pivot point. So if you want to rotate it along the y-axis, simply grab the green circle. If you want to rotate it along the x-axis, simply grab the red circle. And along the z-axis, grab the blue circle. Just like that. Or, for some reason the red circle will make it rotate along the z, and the blue circle will make it rotate along the x in this instance. So that's the rotate tool. Pretty straightforward. Lastly, we have the scale tool. Once again, you have a series of red, blue, and green handles, and some yellow ones in the middle. So let me just explain to you what those do. So the blue one will scale the object on z, x will scale the object on, red will scale the object on x, and green will scale the object on y. And once again, it will scale from the pivot point. So if the pivot point is in the center of the object, it will scale from the center outwards. But if the pivot point is on the bottom of the object, the way that it is here, then it will scale in only one direction, away from or towards that pivot point. The next thing that you can do is you can scale, once again, by constraining only to two axes, by grabbing this little yellow portion that bridges between the two handles. Or you can scale uniformly from the center by grabbing the very middle of the gizmo. So that's the scale tool. It's fairly simple, fairly easy to use. Now at this point I just want to show you one more thing that works in conjunction with the scale very nicely, and that is this little button up here, which can tell you where to scale from, or what to use as the pivot point. So you can choose to use the center of the object, which is this one, or rather the center of the selection. You can choose to use the pivot point center, which is this other icon here, and if you hover over it, it will tell you which one is which. Or you can actually choose to use the center of the world, which is not so apparent when the object is here, but when we put the object up here, and then we choose to use the center of the world for scaling, as you can see, it scales closer to or farther away from the center of world space. I don't use that one very often. I tend to stay mostly on pivot point center, and occasionally on center of the selection. And the same goes for the move tools as well, or the move and rotate tools. You can also change that pivot point, and that will affect your manipulator gizmos. Now, I just want to show you one other way to select these gizmos. It's the one that I use more often. I don't tend to use these three buttons up here: select and move, select and rotate, and select and scale. I tend to use the hotkeys, which are W for move or translate, E for rotate, and R for scale. Once again, W for translate, E for rotate, and R for scale. So that's a quick way to change between those manipulator tools. One other thing that I want to show you is the scale tool itself has a little flyout. It has the uniform scale, which will scale everything uniformly. And then it has the next button here, which is non-uniform scale. So that will work with this little dialog box, which, by the way, you can get on any of these manipulator tools, by right-clicking on them. So if you right click on the move tool, you get a move dialog box. If you right click on the scale, or rotate, you get a rotate dialog box. And if you right click on the scale and transform, you get the scale and transform dialog box. Now, if that were on uniform scale, you would have this one little slider here, or value box, value field, which represents all of the different axes. So you can just move this slider up and down, or you can input a value, and that will scale it uniformly on all different axes. Or you can also do it on each axis individually. And right-clicking on any of those will actually zero them out. I tend not to do that with scale because it will flatten the object completely out into nothing. But, for instance, say you were to do that with the translate tool. Say I were to take my object and just throw it out in space. And say I wanted to get it centered back into the center of world space. So what I could do is I could right-click on these here, and it will actually zero my object out back into the center of world space. So that's very useful, just for making sure things are, completely centered and back to normal. But you'll notice if I change to non-uniform scale, then I have the absolute local fields, which will scale it on the local axis, and I also have the offset world, which I can then change each axis individually. So that's the last one. And then we have a squash option, which will actually stretch and squash the object on all the various different axes, depending on which one that we're pulling or pushing on. Now this one's not very useful for modeling. It comes in more handy when you're animating and you want to make something look like it's got some secondary motion or some bounce to it. Say you were doing a rubber ball or something and you wanted to make it look like it was smushing down when it was hitting the ground, then you could use this stretch and squash scale option, and that would be very useful for that. So right here, now this is our reference coordinates, the one that says view here. We have view, we have screen, we have world, local, gimbal, grid, and so on. What this does is it basically will cause the gizmo to align itself to certain coordinates. View will cause the gizmo to align to the view. So that means that the Y will be facing Y, X will be facing X, and Z will be facing Z, according to the actual three-dimensional views. If you go to screen, the gizmo will change, and it will always align itself to your screen. So even if you're in, some sort of oblong, three-quarter sort of view, you will still actually be able to scale the object perpendicular to the screen. I don't use it for scale very often, only in very rare circumstances. What I tend to use screen for more is for moving or translating, because then you can actually take the object and line it up and just translate it perpendicular to your screen, which sometimes can be a little bit more difficult or annoying to move things in a certain direction if the gizmo is locked to these axes, which are perpendicular to your view plane. So say I wanted to just look at the object from here, and I wanted to try and move it exactly sideways, perpendicular to my view. I couldn't do that right now because my gizmo is aligned to my actual 3D views. So I could just take this and turn it to screen, and now I can move it exactly sideways or exactly vertical compared to my view. So that's kind of useful. World will offset it to world space. That doesn't really affect it differently when you're dealing with a single object, but if you have multiple objects, they will all offset in different directions based on world space coordinates. I don't tend to use that one very often. The one that I tend to use the most is view, screen, or local. Now what local will do is it will align the gizmo to the object's pivot point, which is right now aligned to the views. So there's no difference between local and view at the moment. Let's say I were to take the object and rotate it, like that. Now if I were to try to translate the object based on view, the gizmo would still be aligned to the 3D view plane. But what if I want to translate the object so it moves perpendicular to the object itself, to its orientation and not to the view plane? Then I can move to local, and now I can move the object perpendicular to itself, to its own pivot point. So that is also very useful. And the same goes for rotate. Right now, if I want to rotate the object, it only rotates based on the 3D views. But if I change to local, I can now rotate the object based on its own pivot point. So these buttons come in very handy too when trying to navigate. Okay, let's keep moving forward. After that, I'm going to skip these two because I don't find them very useful. Here are snaps. Snaps is very useful as well because it will actually snap your cursor to the grid, so you can, later on I'll show you can grab it